In Acts 2 and 3 of Henry VI, Part 2, we come to the death of the good Duke Humphrey that we were promised in the play's subtitle. But before that, Shakespeare takes the time to show us just what sort of a man England is about to lose, to make the death all the more tragic. We already know that he's patriotic, that he wants what's best for his country because he idolized his brother, Henry V, and he wants to see the kingdom that he left behind well and thriving. But in Act 2, we learn that he's also noble, that he's fair, and that he's willing to trust himself to the systems of law that are in place and to abide by their dictates. He disowns his wife when news comes out that she practiced witchcraft to get answers about the future of the state. And now he also willingly gives up his protectorship at the bidding of King Henry, who has been prodded into making this request of him by the other nobles. And Henry's careful to say that he still loves his uncle. This isn't firing in disgrace. He still values Gloucester's opinion. But he basically says, look, I'm of age now to make decisions for myself, so hand your staff over to me. And Gloucester does, without complaint. He doesn't put up a fight or accuse any of the other nobles of meddling, which they've been doing. The king's word, the law, to him is final. And this is illustrated more so in the scene where he encounters his wife, the Duchess, who has been condemned to a walk of public shame rather similar to the walk that Richard II undertook back in his play. The commoners are jeering and throwing insults at her as she's led off to where she's going to meet her sentence, which is confinement. And when she sees Gloucester in the crowd, she reproves him a bit, saying, "Oh, how can you stand by while this shame and disgrace is heaped upon me? Don't you know that I was set up? Don't you know that you're going to be next, now that I'm out of the way?" And Gloucester, in response to this, reveals the full trust, again, that he has in the impartial sentencing of the law. He says this, "Ah, Nell, forbear. Thou aimest all awry. I must offend before I be attainted. And had I 20 times so many foes, and each of them had 20 times their power, all these could not procure me any scathe, so long as I am loyal, true, and crimeless." So this, again, is a noble sentiment, and it may even be a correct one, coming from the perspective of somebody who's upright in heart. This is the sentiment of a man who we would probably want to put in charge of things. But Gloucester's problem is that the law itself is now unstable, because it's being corrupted by those with power and influence over the king. Another thing that Shakespeare illustrates for us in this act is Gloucester's wisdom. There's a rather comedic scene where King Henry, Gloucester, and some of the other nobles are out in the countryside hawking, and all of a sudden, a crowd of locals rush up to them, and they say that a miracle's happened. That there's a man named Simcox who was born blind, and he's now miraculously received his sight while praying at the shrine of a saint called Saint Alban. And King Henry, being very pious, he throws up his hands and he shouts, "Praise the Lord, bring him here so that we can meet him and see this great miracle." And so the locals bring Simcox and his wife over to meet the nobility. And everybody's marveling at what's occurred. Again, it's this great miracle. And then Gloucester steps forward and says, "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" And he says, I don't think this man's sight has fully recovered yet." And Simcox, who's listening, goes, "Oh, yes, it has. It's a miracle. Of course it's recovered. What are you talking about?" And Gloucester goes, "Oh, really? Prove it. "What color is my cloak?" And Simcox tells him, "Oh, it's red." And then Gloucester asks him what the color of another man's cloak is, and he answers that too. And then Gloucester says, "So your sight may have miraculously returned to you, but there's no way, if you were really born blind, that you would be able to identify the names of the colors that you're now seeing. You might be seeing red, black, and blue, but how do you know that that's their names?" And so the deception is discovered. These were some local peasants who, probably having heard about King Henry's gentle nature, thought that they could pull a fast one on him. But Gloucester is able to sniff out the scam and help to maintain the dignity of the English court. And this, again, all goes to show what sort of a man is actually being lost with the loss of Duke Humphrey. A wise, upright, patriotic counselor who is disliked by all of the wrong people for all of the right reasons. In fact, they all agreed to put aside their differences until he's taken out of the way. You have Queen Margaret, Suffolk, Somerset, and the Duke of York, and don't forget the Cardinal Winchester, who's always been Gloucester's enemy. They all have a conference where it's decided that Gloucester needs to be dealt with first before they can all start attacking each other. And remember that none of these nobles trusts or likes the other, but they know that an honorable man, a loyal man, is a danger to their own personal ambitions, and so they're willing to set everything else aside until getting him out of the way is accomplished. And the time to act is now. They smell blood in the water. Gloucester's reputation has already suffered a blow thanks to his wife's actions. And now he's accused of contributing to the reversals that the English are suffering in France. Somerset, who, remember, in the last act was named regent, comes back from France to tell the court that all's been lost. The French have rebelled, and their men have been completely driven out of the country, and everyone standing around nearby just groans. Because, after all, this is the conclusion of the 100 Years' War. This is the end of the war that so many of them had personally sacrificed life and limb for. So many of their fathers and their grandfathers had sacrificed life and limb for. And what's King Henry's reaction to the news? Is he worried about his father's legacy or about his own reputation? No. His reaction is typical for him. He goes, "Oh man. Oh well, let God's will be done." And I think this is the point of why many scholars accuse Henry VI of being too pious. Religious principles in a leader are, after all, a good thing. We want our leaders to have them. But we've seen how somebody like Henry V was devout and still managed to act, still managed to be a good king. Henry VI, his devotion comes with a brand of fatalism peculiar to himself. So what's fatalism? Well, fatalism is the belief that we don't really have any control over our destinies. That what's meant to happen will happen, and so there's really no point in even worrying about it. It's almost as if free will isn't a thing. And this is why Henry seems so passive in these plays, even when it comes to his decision-making. He acts as if he has no control over things, even though he has more control and more power, in theory, than any of the others around him. He just resigns himself to accepting whatever is done to him or to his realm without feeling the necessity to raise a hand in his own defense. Anyway, Somerset comes back, and at the same time, Suffolk lays the blame for the war's loss on Gloucester. Apparently, Gloucester was supposed to send the soldiers their pay, which he didn't do, and it was because of this that the soldiers abandoned their posts and didn't fight that well. And Suffolk accuses him of accepting a bribe from the French to do this, to withhold their pay, and he arrests him of treason. He accuses him of treason. And at the same time, the other nobles, who are all standing around in the courtroom, they start naming other complaints that have been lodged against Gloucester, such as being overly harsh and cruel with sentencing and with punishing common criminals. And so everybody's pointing the finger at him, accusing him, and Gloucester says, "I've got nothing to hide. I've done nothing wrong. Take me into custody. I'll prove my innocence by trial." And now here's where his trust in the law is going to come back to bite him. Henry, at this time, he also stands up for Gloucester. He says, "This is crazy. I think you're all wrong. I know my uncle. I know that he's noble and that he wouldn't do any of the things that you're accusing him of." But then he says, "But you all do what seems best to you." So again, it's like he's got no power or control over events, even though he's the king. Listen to his speech as Gloucester's being led away. And notice how clearly he seems to see through the schemes and the plots of the nobles, and even through the schemes of his own wife. But even though he can see through those schemes, he doesn't do anything to stop them. He says, "I, Margaret, my heart is drowned with grief, whose flood begins to flow within mine eyes. My body round and girt with misery. For what's more miserable than discontent? Ah, Uncle Humphrey, in thy face I see the map of honor, truth, and loyalty. And yet, good Humphrey, is the hour to come that ere I proved thee false or feared thy faith? What lowering star now envies thy estate, that these great lords, and Margaret our queen, do seek subversion of thy harmless life? Thou never didst them wrong, nor no man wrong. And as the butcher takes away the calf, and binds the wretch, and beats it when it strays, bearing it to the bloody slaughterhouse, even so remorseless have they borne him hence. And as the dame runs lowering up and down, looking the way her harmless young one went, and can do naught but wail her darling's loss, even so myself bewails good Gloucester's case, with sad, unhelpful tears, and with dimmed eyes look after him, and cannot do him good, so mighty are his vowed enemies. His fortunes I will weep, and twixt each groan say, Who's a traitor? Gloucester, he is none." It's the sort of speech that, I guess, it just makes you want to strangle Henry. But again, he's following his conscience. Like Gloucester, he believes in the strength of truth and of law and of order. It's the tragic fault of both of them that they aren't living in a time when any of those things can be trusted. Truth does not out. They say truth will out. Truth does not out in the England of this time. So, as Gloucester is awaiting his trial, Cardinal Winchester and Suffolk decide between themselves to kill him. They hire a few assassins to do the deed, and when Henry and the court come to summon him for his trial, they find that he's already been killed. And then, interestingly, Henry immediately accuses Suffolk. Why? Well, I guess we could say Suffolk is the first to report on the death. He storms out from Gloucester's bedchamber as if he's grieved at what he's seen, and as he's describing what he's seen, Henry tells him to get out of his sight. And Margaret then immediately comes to Suffolk's defense, and she says, "This isn't his fault. Why are you yelling at him?" But then Warwick makes the same accusation. And after examining Gloucester's body, Warwick makes it plain that Gloucester certainly didn't go peacefully in his sleep. It looks like he's been murdered. And by the way, this is an example of one of Shakespeare's great descriptive pieces, or unscenes, as they've sometimes been called, which is where what's being described is more vivid and thrilling than if the spectacle were actually on stage itself. So as Warwick is describing Gloucester's body, we get these lines. He goes, "See how the blood is settled in his face. Oft have I seen a timely parted ghost, of ashy semblance, meagre, pale and bloodless, being all descended to the labouring heart, who in the conflict that it holds with death attracts the same for aidance against the enemy, which with the heart there cools, and never returneth to blush and beautify the cheek again. But see, his face is black and full of blood, his eyeballs further out than when he lived, staring full ghastly, like a strangled man. His hair upreared, his nostrils stretched with struggling, his hands abroad displayed, as one that grasped and tugged for life, and was by strength subdued. Look on the sheets his hair, you see, is sticking, his well-proportioned beard made rough and rugged, like to the summer's corn by tempests lodged. It cannot be but he was murdered here. The least of all these signs were probable." So it's just a really great description of a body that's been violently strangled to death. His hair all disheveled, the blood still in his face, his eyeballs staring. And he accuses Suffolk and Winchester as well, since they were both apparently in charge of keeping Gloucester safe. So even if they didn't murder him with their own hands, they are responsible for the fact that he's dead. And things get so heated in this exchange that Warwick challenges Suffolk to a duel. And so they both arm themselves in a huff, and they're storming out of the castle. Margaret's frantic because she doesn't want Suffolk to get hurt. And Henry, he's throwing up his hands and saying, "Oh, so I guess we're having a duel now. Good. God will prove who the innocent man is." Again, he's just rolling with the punches. But before they can duel, remember on stage, they both would have exited the stage to go and make preparations for this fight. They're chased back into the castle, back into the room by an angry mob. Now, there's armed men in the presence of the royal couple and all of these nobles, which probably shouldn't be happening. How did they get in there? Commoners are banging on the doors, and nobody knows what's going on. And in the midst of all this chaos, Winchester has slipped away quietly without saying a word. That'll be important later. And so finally, one of the nobles, Salisbury, reports on the mob's motives. And he says this, talking to the king, "Dread lord, the commoners send you word by me, unless Lord Suffolk straight be done to death, or banished fair England's territories, they will by violence tear him from your palace, and torture him with grievous lingering death. They say, by him the good Duke Humphrey died. They say in him they fear your highness's death. And mere instinct of love and loyalty, free from a stubborn opposite intent, as being thought to contradict your liking, makes them thus forward in his banishment. They say in care of your most royal person, that if your highness should intend to sleep, and charge that no man should disturb your rest in pain of your dislike, or pain of death, yet, notwithstanding such a strait edict, were there a serpent seen, with forked tongue, that slyly glided towards your majesty, it were but necessary you were waked, lest, being suffered in that harmful slumber, the mortal worm might make the sleep eternal. And therefore do they cry, though you forbid, that they will guard you, where you will or no, from such fell serpents as false Suffolk is, with whose envenomed and fatal sting your loving uncle, 20 times his worth, they say, is shamefully bereft of life." So, this is kind of funny. And at the same time, it's indicative of how bad things have gotten. The commoners are essentially saying, Henry, you're asleep on the job here. And if you won't protect yourself, we'll protect you for you. You're not ruling. you're letting the wicked get away without punishment. So we're going to see the punishment out instead. And the mob is perfectly correct in this assessment. So Henry listens to them here, and he banishes Suffolk, which sends Margaret into a spiral. She starts crying, saying, "Oh, why did I ever come here? How could my husband be so cruel?" She really just lets out this really long, self-pitying rant. And when this fails to get her way, she then curses Henry and Warwick and the others as they're going away. And we see now, for the first time, how truly Suffolk's strange, convoluted plan worked. Margaret is in love with him. They embrace and they kiss each other as he sets off on his banishment. And they swear that each is the other's paradise and that they'll find each other again. And then he takes off. Henry and Warwick, meanwhile, are summoned to Winchester's rooms because he, after he quietly slipped out of the room earlier, has apparently suffered some sort of nervous attack. He's gasping, clawing at his bed sheets, and according to the servants, he's blaspheming God. Not a good look for a cardinal, obviously. And you would think that now that his longtime foe, his rival of all these years, Gloucester, is dead, he'd be happy. This should be his moment of triumph. But he's suffering pain. We see that he's suffering pangs of conscience instead that are so debilitating that he's dying. Indeed, we could all almost even take this as an act of divine judgment or an act of retribution. He's just orchestrated the death of an innocent man, and now he's immediately being struck down as well. Now Henry, who's always revered his uncle as a wise, spiritual mentor, he's understandably disturbed by all of this. He leans down over the writhing cardinal, and he says, "Uncle, if your heart's in the right place, if you're thinking of heaven's bliss, make some sort of a sign so that we can know it." And Winchester doesn't. In fact, he immediately dies. And someone standing nearby says, "Well, if that's how he faced death, imagine how he lived." And Henry, who never wants to think bad of anybody, says, "Hush, hush, we're all sinners. We shouldn't speak ill of him." But we as the readers know that Winchester has been devising mischief for some time now. And it's fitting that he shouldn't long outlive the man who he slandered and had executed. I also think that it's worth noting here that a lot of this is Shakespeare's invention. This is him dramatizing history. Gloucester and Winchester, historically, died within a few months of each other, not on the same day. And while there was suspicion of foul play in Gloucester's murder, Winchester apparently just died of old age. But you can see why Shakespeare gave the circumstances a bit of flair, once again telescoping events so that things seem to occur right on the backs of each other. Meanwhile, York, Richard, Duke of York, is getting ready to make his move. While all of the drama with Gloucester has been going on, he's dispatched to Ireland to quell a rebellion there, and he's been given men to do it. But before he goes, he tells the audience, in soliloquy, that he's paid off a man named Jack Cade to go around the city while he's gone, to go around London and claim to be a descendant of the Mortimer line. He wants Jack Cade to pretend to be a descendant of Edmund Mortimer. And he says that he's doing this to test the population, to see how receptive they'd be to a challenger to Henry's throne. And so this shows a great deal of cunning on York's part. And it also speaks to the scenes we saw earlier in the play about the armorer and his apprentice who mutually accused each other before the court. It's possible that York was already putting feelers out there, even then, trying to figure out who would be loyal to him and who wouldn't be. And so maybe that's why the armorer, Thomas Horner, would make the claim that he was the rightful king. Maybe he'd caught wind of this somehow. We'll see the absolute chaos that ensues from this plot of York's in next week's reading. So for next time, read just Act 4. We're going to take our time on Act 4. There's a lot going on, so just read that one. Thanks for watching.